Chapter 51 of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
We will now turn to a certain still, cold, cloudy afternoon, about the commencement of December, when the first fall of snow lay thinly scattered over the blighted fields and frozen roads, or stored more thickly in the hollows of the deep cart ruts, and footsteps of men and horses, impressed in the now petrified mire of last month's drenching rains. I remember it well, for I was walking home from the vicarage, with no less remarkable a personage than Miss Eliza Millward by my side. I had been to call upon her father, a sacrifice to civility, undertaken entirely to please my mother, not myself, for I hated to go near the house, not merely on account of my antipathy to the once so bewitching Eliza, but because I had not half forgiven the old gentleman himself for his ill opinion of Mrs. Huntingdon. For though now constrained to acknowledge himself mistaken in his former judgment, he still maintained that she had done wrong to leave her husband. It was a violation of her sacred duties as a wife, and the tempting of Providence by laying herself open to temptation, and nothing short of bodily ill usage, and that of no trifling nature, could excuse such a step, nor even that, for in such a case she ought to appeal to the laws for protection. But it was not of him I intended to speak. It was of his daughter Eliza. Just as I was taking leave of the vicar, she entered the room, ready equipped for a walk.
"I was just coming to see your sister, Mr. Markham,"
said she,
"and so if you have no objection I'll accompany you home. I like company when I'm walking out. Don't you?"
Yes, when it's agreeable,
"That of course,"
rejoined the young lady, smiling archly. So we proceeded together.
"Shall I find Rose at home, do you think?"
said she, as we closed the garden gate and set our faces towards Linden Car. I believe so.
"I trust I shall, for I've a little bit of news for her, if you haven't forestalled me."
I?
"Yes. Do you know what Mr. Lawrence is gone for?"
She looked up anxiously for my reply. Is he gone? Said I, and her face brightened.
"Ah, then he hasn't told you about his sister."
What of her? I demanded in terror, lest some evil should have befallen her.
"Oh, Mr. Markham, how you blush!"
cried she, with a tormenting laugh.
"You have not forgotten her yet. But you had better be quick about it, I can tell you. For alas, alas, she's going to be married next Thursday."
No, Miss Eliza, that's false.
"Do you charge me with a falsehood, sir?"
You are misinformed.
"Am I? Do you know better, then?"
I think I do.
"What makes you look so pale, then?"
said she, smiling with delight at my emotion.
"Is it anger at poor me for telling such a fib? Well, I only tell the tale as 'twas told to me. I don't vouch for the truth of it, but at the same time I don't see what reason Sarah should have for deceiving me, or her informant for deceiving her. And that was what she told me the footman told her, that Mrs. Huntingdon was going to be married on Thursday, and Mr. Lawrence was gone to the wedding. She did tell me the name of the gentleman, but I've forgotten that. Perhaps you can assist me to remember it. Is there not some one that lives near, or frequently visits the neighbourhood, that has long been attached to her? A Mr.—oh dear, Mr.—
Hargrave, suggested I, with a bitter smile.
"You're right,"
cried she.
"That was the very name."
Impossible, Miss Eliza, I exclaimed, in a tone that made her start.
"Well, you know that's what they told me,"
said she, composedly staring me in the face, and then she broke out into a long, shrill laugh that put me to my wits' end with fury.
"Really, you must excuse me,"
cried she.
"I know it's very rude, but did you really think to marry her yourself? Dear, dear, what a pity! Gracious, Mr. Markham, are you going to faint? Oh, mercy! Shall I call this man? Here, Jacob."
But checking the word on her lips, I seized her arm and gave it, I think, a pretty severe squeeze, for she shrank into herself with a faint cry of pain or terror. But the spirit within her was not subdued. Instantly rallying, she continued, with well-feigned concern,
"What can I do for you? Will you have some water, some brandy? I dare say they have some in the public-house down there, if you'll let me run."
"Have done with this nonsense," cried I sternly. She looked confounded, almost frightened again, for a moment. "You know I hate such jests," I continued.
"Jests, indeed! I wasn't jesting."
"You were laughing at all events, and I don't like to be laughed at," returned I, making violent efforts to speak with proper dignity and composure, and to say nothing but what was coherent and sensible. "And since you are in such a merry mood, Miss Eliza, you must be good enough company for yourself, and therefore I shall leave you to finish your walk alone, for now I think of it, I have business elsewhere, so good evening." With that I left her, smothering her malicious laughter, and turned aside into the fields, springing up the bank and pushing through the nearest gap in the hedge, determined at once to prove the truth, or rather the falsehood, of her story. I hastened to Woodford as fast as my legs could carry me, first veering round by a circuitous course. But the moment I was out of sight of my fair tormentor, cutting away across the country, just as a bird might fly, over pasture land and fallow and stubble and lane, clearing hedges and ditches and hurdles, till I came to the young squire's gates. Never till now had I known the full fervour of my love, the full strength of my hopes, not wholly crushed even in my hours of deepest despondency, always tenaciously clinging to the thought that one day she might be mine, or if not that, at least that something of my memory, some slight remembrance of our friendship and our love, would be for ever cherished in her heart. I marched up to the door, determined, if I saw the master, to question him boldly concerning his sister, to wait and hesitate no longer, but cast false delicacy and stupid pride behind my back, and know my fate at once. "Is Mr. Lawrence at home?" I eagerly asked of the servant that opened the door.
"No, sir. Master went yesterday,"
replied he, looking very alert. "Went where?"
"To Grassdale, sir. Wasn't you aware, sir? He's very close, is master,"
said the fellow, with a foolish, simpering grin.
"I suppose, sir—"
But I turned and left him, without waiting to hear what he supposed. I was not going to stand there to expose my tortured feelings to the insolent laughter and impertinent curiosity of a fellow like that. But what was to be done now? Could it be possible that she had left me for that man? I could not believe it. Me she might forsake, but not to give herself to him. Well, I would know the truth. To no concerns of daily life could I attend while this tempest of doubt and dread, of jealousy and rage, distracted me. I would take the morning coach from L. The evening one would be already gone, and fly to Grassdale. I must be there before the marriage. And why? Because the thought struck me that perhaps I might prevent it, that if I did not, she and I might both lament it to the latest moment of our lives. It struck me that someone might have belied me to her. Perhaps her brother, yes, no doubt her brother, had persuaded her that I was false and faithless, and, taking advantage of her natural indignation, and perhaps her desponding carelessness about her future life, had urged her artfully, cruelly, on to this other marriage, in order to secure her from me. If this was the case, and if she should only discover her mistake when too late to repair it, to what a life of misery and vain regret might she be doomed, as well as me, and what remorse for me to think my foolish scruples had induced it all. Oh, I must see her. She must know my truth, even if I told it at the church door. I might pass for a madman or an impertinent fool. Even she might be offended at such an interruption, or at least might tell me it was now too late. But if I could save her, if she might be mine, it was too rapturous a thought. Winged by this hope, and goaded by these fears, I hurried homewards to prepare for my departure on the morrow. I told my mother that urgent business, which admitted no delay, but which I could not then explain, called me away. My deep anxiety and serious preoccupation could not be concealed from her maternal eyes, and I had much ado to calm her apprehensions of some disastrous mystery. That night there came a heavy fall of snow, which so retarded the progress of the coaches on the following day that I was almost driven to distraction. I travelled all night, of course, for this was Wednesday. Tomorrow morning, doubtless, the marriage would take place, but the night was long and dark. The snow heavily clogged the wheels and balled the horses' feet. The animals were consumedly lazy, the coachman most execrably cautious, the passengers confoundedly apathetic in their supine indifference to the rate of our progression. Instead of assisting me to bully the several coachmen and urge them forward, they merely stared and grinned at my impatience. One fellow even ventured to rally me upon it, but I silenced him with a look that quelled him for the rest of the journey, and when, at the last stage, I would have taken the reins into my own hand, they all with one accord opposed it. It was broad daylight when we entered M and drew up at the Rose and Crown. I alighted and called aloud for a post-chaise to Grassdale. There was none to be had. The only one in the town was under repair. A gig, then, a fly, car, anything, only be quick. There was a gig, but not a horse to spare. I sent into the town to seek one, but they were such an intolerable time about it that I could wait no longer. I thought my own feet could carry me sooner, and bidding them send the conveyance after me, if it were ready within an hour, I set off as fast as I could walk. The distance was little more than 6 miles, but the road was strange, and I had to keep stopping to inquire my way, hallooing to carters and clodhoppers, and frequently invading the cottages, for there were few abroad that winter's morning, sometimes knocking up the lazy people from their beds, for where so little work was to be done, perhaps so little food and fire to be had, they cared not to curtail their slumbers. I had no time to think of them, however. Aching with weariness and desperation, I hurried on. The gig did not overtake me, and it was well I had not waited for it. Vexatious rather that I had been fool enough to wait so long. At length, however, I entered the neighbourhood of Grassdale. I approached the little rural church, but lo, there stood a train of carriages before it. It needed not the white favours bedecking the servants and horses, nor the merry voices of the village idlers assembled to witness the show, to apprise me that there was a wedding within. I ran in among them, demanding with breathless eagerness, had the ceremony long commenced? They only gaped and stared. In my desperation I pushed past them, and was about to enter the churchyard gate, when a group of ragged urchins, that had been hanging like bees to the window, suddenly dropped off and made a rush for the porch, vociferating in the uncouth dialect of their country something which signified, "It's over, they're coming out." If Eliza Millward had seen me then, she might indeed have been delighted. I grasped the gate-post for support, and stood intently gazing towards the door to take my last look on my soul's delight, my first on that detested mortal who had torn her from my heart, and doomed her, I was certain, to a life of misery and hollow vain repining. For what happiness could she enjoy with him? I did not wish to shock her with my presence now, but I had not power to move away. Forth came the bride and bridegroom. Him I saw not. I had eyes for none but her. A long veil shrouded half her graceful form, but did not hide it. I could see that while she carried her head erect, her eyes were bent upon the ground, and her face and neck were suffused with a crimson blush, but every feature was radiant with smiles, and gleaming through the misty whiteness of her veil were clusters of golden ringlets. Oh heavens! It was not my Helen. The first glimpse made me start, but my eyes were darkened with exhaustion and despair. Dare I trust them? Yes, it is not she. It was a younger, slighter, rosier beauty, lovely indeed, but with far less dignity and depth of soul, without that indefinable grace, that keenly spiritual yet gentle charm, that ineffable power to attract and subjugate the heart, my heart at least. I looked at the bridegroom. It was Frederick Lawrence. I wiped away the cold drops that were trickling down my forehead, and stepped back as he approached. But his eyes fell upon me, and he knew me, altered as my appearance must have been.
"Is that you, Markham?"
said he, startled and confounded at the apparition, perhaps, too, at the wildness of my looks. "Yes, Lawrence. Is that you?" I mustered the presence of mind to reply. He smiled and coloured, as if half proud and half ashamed of his identity, and if he had reason to be proud of the sweet lady on his arm, he had no less cause to be ashamed of having concealed his good fortune so long.
"Allow me to introduce you to my bride,"
said he, endeavouring to hide his embarrassment by an assumption of careless gaiety.
"Esther, this is Mr. Markham, my friend Markham, Mrs. Lawrence, late Miss Hargrave."
I bowed to the bride, and vehemently wrung the bridegroom's hand. "Why did you not tell me of this?" I said, reproachfully pretending a resentment I did not feel, for in truth I was almost wild with joy to find myself so happily mistaken, and overflowing with affection to him, for this, and for the base injustice I felt that I had done him in my mind. He might have wronged me, but not to that extent, and as I had hated him like a demon for the last 40 hours, the reaction from such a feeling was so great that I could pardon all offences for the moment, and love him in spite of them too.
"I did tell you,"
said he, with an air of guilty confusion.
"You received my letter?"
"What letter?"
"The one announcing my intended marriage."
"I never received the most distant hint of such an intention."
"It must have crossed you on your way, then. It should have reached you yesterday morning. It was rather late, I acknowledge. But what brought you here, then, if you received no information?"
It was now my turn to be confounded, but the young lady, who had been busily patting the snow with her foot during our short sotto voce colloquy, very opportunely came to my assistance by pinching her companion's arm, and whispering a suggestion that his friend should be invited to step into the carriage and go with them, it being scarcely agreeable to stand there among so many gazers, and keeping their friends waiting into the bargain.
"And so cold as it is, too,"
said he, glancing with dismay at her slight drapery, and immediately handing her into the carriage.
"Markham, will you come? We are going to Paris, but we can drop you anywhere between this and Dover."
"No, thank you. Good-bye. I needn't wish you a pleasant journey, but I shall expect a very handsome apology, some time, mind, and scores of letters before we meet again." He shook my hand, and hastened to take his place beside his lady. This was no time or place for explanation or discourse. We had already stood long enough to excite the wonder of the village sightseers, and perhaps the wrath of the attendant bridal party, though of course all this passed in a much shorter time than I have taken to relate, or even than you will take to read it. I stood beside the carriage, and, the window being down, I saw my happy friend fondly encircle his companion's waist with his arm, while she rested her glowing cheek on his shoulder, looking the very impersonation of loving, trusting bliss. In the interval between the footman's closing the door and taking his place behind, she raised her smiling brown eyes to his face, observing playfully,
"I fear you must think me very insensible, Frederick. I know it is the custom for ladies to cry on these occasions, but I couldn't squeeze a tear for my life."
He only answered with a kiss, and pressed her still closer to his bosom.
"But what is this?"
he murmured.
"Why, Esther, you're crying now."
"Oh, it's nothing. It's only too much happiness, and the wish,"
sobbed she,
"that our dear Helen were as happy as ourselves."
"Bless you for that wish," I inwardly responded, as the carriage rolled away, "and heaven grant it be not wholly vain." I thought a cloud had suddenly darkened her husband's face as she spoke. What did he think? Could he grudge such happiness to his dear sister and his friend as he now felt himself? At such a moment it was impossible. The contrast between her fate and his must darken his bliss for a time. Perhaps, too, he thought of me. Perhaps he regretted the part he had had in preventing our union, by omitting to help us, if not by actually plotting against us. I exonerated him from that charge now, and deeply lamented my former ungenerous suspicions. But he had wronged us. Still, I hoped, I trusted that he had. He had not attempted to check the course of our love by actually damming up the streams in their passage, but he had passively watched the two currents wandering through life's arid wilderness, declining to clear away the obstructions that divided them, and secretly hoping that both would lose themselves in the sand before they could be joined in one. And meantime he had been quietly proceeding with his own affairs. Perhaps his heart and head had been so full of his fair lady that he had had but little thought to spare for others. Doubtless he had made his first acquaintance with her, his first intimate acquaintance at least, during his 3 months' sojourn at F. For I now recollected that he had once casually let fall an intimation that his aunt and sister had a young friend staying with them at the time, and this accounted for at least one half his silence about all transactions there. Now too I saw a reason for many little things that had slightly puzzled me before, among the rest, for sundry departures from Woodford, and absences more or less prolonged, for which he never satisfactorily accounted, and concerning which he hated to be questioned on his return. Well might the servant say his master was very close. But why this strange reserve to me? Partly from that remarkable idiosyncrasy to which I have before alluded, partly perhaps from tenderness to my feelings, or fear to disturb my philosophy by touching upon the infectious theme of love.
End of chapter 51. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
The tardy gig had overtaken me at last. I entered it, and bade the man who brought it drive to Grassdale Manor. I was too busy with my own thoughts to care to drive it myself. I would see Mrs. Huntingdon. There could be no impropriety in that, now that her husband had been dead above a year, and by her indifference, or her joy, at my unexpected arrival, I could soon tell whether her heart was truly mine. But my companion, a loquacious, forward fellow, was not disposed to leave me to the indulgence of my private cogitations.
"Here they go,"
said he, as the carriages filed away before us.
"There'll be brave doings on yonder to-day, as to what come to-morrow. Know anything of that family, sir? Or you're a stranger in these parts?"
I know them by report.
There's the best of 'em gone, anyhow. And I suppose the old missus is a-going to leave after this stir's got her overed, and take herself off somewhere to live on her bit of a jointure, and the young un, at least the new un, she's not so very young, is coming down to live at the Grove.
Is Mr. Hargrave married then?
Ay, sir, a few months since. He should ha' been wed afore to a widow lady, but they couldn't agree over the money. She'd a rare long purse, and Mr. Hargrave wanted it all to hisself, but she wouldn't let it go, and so then they fell out. This one isn't quite as rich, nor as handsome either, but she hasn't been married before. She's very plain, they say, and getting on to 40 or past, and so, you know, if she didn't jump at this hopportunity, she thought she'd never get a better. I guess she thought such a handsome young husband was worth all 'at ever she had, and he might take it and welcome. But I lay she'll rue her bargain afore long. They say she begins already to see how he isn't not altogether that nice, generous, polite, delightful gentleman that she thought him afore marriage. He begins a being careless and masterful already. Ay, and she'll find him harder and carelesser nor she thinks on."
You seem to be well acquainted with him, I observed.
"I am, sir. I've known him since he was quite a young gentleman, and a proud un he was, and a wilful. I was servant yonder for several years, but I couldn't stand her niggardly ways. She got ever longer and worse, did missus, with her nipping and screwing and watching and grudging. So I thought I'd find another place.
"Are we not near the house?" said I, interrupting him.
Yes, sir, yon's the park.
My heart sank within me to behold that stately mansion in the midst of its expanse of grounds. The park as beautiful now in its wintry garb as it could be in its summer glory. The majestic sweep, the undulating swell and fall, displayed to full advantage in that robe of dazzling purity, stainless and printless, save one long winding track left by the trooping deer, the stately timber trees with their heavy laden branches gleaming white against the dull grey sky, the deep encircling woods, the broad expanse of water sleeping in frozen quiet, and the weeping ash and willow drooping their snow-clad boughs above it, all presented a picture, striking indeed, and pleasing to an unencumbered mind, but by no means encouraging to me. There was one comfort, however. All this was entailed upon little Arthur, and could not, under any circumstances, strictly speaking, be his mother's. But how was she situated? Overcoming with a sudden effort my repugnance to mention her name to my garrulous companion, I asked him if he knew whether her late husband had left a will, and how the property had been disposed of. Oh yes, he knew all about it, and I was quickly informed that to her had been left the full control and management of the estate during her son's minority, besides the absolute, unconditional possession of her own fortune. But I knew that her father had not given her much, and the small additional sum that had been settled upon her before marriage. Before the close of the explanation, we drew up at the park gates. Now for the trial, if I should find her within. But alas, she might be still at Stanningley. Her brother had given me no intimation to the contrary. I inquired at the porter's lodge if Mrs. Huntingdon were at home. No, she was with her aunt in Shire, but was expected to return before Christmas. She usually spent most of her time at Stanningley, only coming to Grassdale occasionally, when the management of affairs, or the interest of her tenants and dependents, required her presence. "Near what town is Stanningley situated?" I asked. The requisite information was soon obtained. "Now then, my man, give me the reins, and we'll return to M. I must have some breakfast at the Rose and Crown, and then away to Stanningley by the first coach for—" At M I had time, before the coach started, to replenish my forces with a hearty breakfast, and to obtain the refreshment of my usual morning's ablutions, and the amelioration of some slight change in my toilet, and also to dispatch a short note to my mother, excellent son that I was, to assure her that I was still in existence, and to excuse my non-appearance at the expected time. It was a long journey to Stanningley for those slow travelling days, but I did not deny myself needful refreshment on the road, nor even a night's rest at a wayside inn, choosing rather to brook a little delay than to present myself worn, wild, and weather-beaten before my mistress and her aunt, who would be astonished enough to see me without that. Next morning, therefore, I not only fortified myself with as substantial a breakfast as my excited feelings would allow me to swallow, but I bestowed a little more than usual time and care upon my toilet, and furnished with a change of linen from my small carpet-bag, well-brushed clothes, well-polished boots, and neat new gloves, I mounted the Lightning, and resumed my journey. I had nearly 2 stages yet before me, but the coach, I was informed, passed through the neighbourhood of Stanningley, and having desired to be set down as near the hall as possible, I had nothing to do but to sit with folded arms and speculate upon the coming hour. It was a clear frosty morning. The very fact of sitting exalted aloft, surveying the snowy landscape and sweet sunny sky, inhaling the pure bracing air, and crunching away over the crisp frozen snow, was exhilarating enough in itself, but add to this the idea of to what goal I was hastening, and whom I expected to meet, and you may have some faint conception of my frame of mind at the time. Only a faint one, though, for my heart swelled with unspeakable delight, and my spirits rose almost to madness in spite of my prudent endeavours to bind them down to a reasonable platitude, by thinking of the undeniable difference between Helen's rank and mine, of all that she had passed through since our parting, of her long unbroken silence, and above all, of her cool cautious aunt, whose counsels she would doubtless be careful not to slight again. These considerations made my heart flutter with anxiety, and my chest heave with impatience to get the crisis over. But they could not dim her image in my mind, or mar the vivid recollection of what had been said and felt between us, or destroy the keen anticipation of what was to be. In fact, I could not realize their terrors now. Towards the close of the journey, however, a couple of my fellow passengers kindly came to my assistance, and brought me low enough.
"Fine land this,"
said one of them, pointing with his umbrella to the wide fields on the right, conspicuous for their compact hedgerows, deep well-cut ditches, and fine timber trees, growing sometimes on the borders, sometimes in the midst of the enclosure.
"Very fine land, if you saw it in the summer or spring."
"Aye,"
responded the other, a gruff elderly man, with a drab greatcoat buttoned up to the chin, and a cotton umbrella between his knees.
"It's old Maxwell's, I suppose."
"It was his, sir, but he's dead now, you're aware, and has left it all to his niece.
"Oh."
Every rood of it, and the mansion house and all, every hottom of his worldly goods, except just a trifle by way of remembrance to his nephew down in Shire, and an annuity to his wife."
"It's strange, sir."
"It is, sir, and she wasn't his own niece neither, but he had no near relations of his own, none but a nephew he'd quarrelled with, and he always had a partiality for this one, and then his wife advised him to it, they say. She'd brought most of the property, and it was her wish that this lady should have it."
"She'll be a fine catch for somebody."
"She will so. She's a widow, but quite young yet, and uncommon handsome, a fortune of her own besides, and only one child, and she's nursing a fine estate for him in there'll be lots to speak for her. 'Fraid there's no chance for's,"
facetiously jogging me with his elbow, as well as his companion.
"No offence, sir, I hope?"
To me.
I should think she'll marry none but a nobleman myself. Look here, sir,"
resumed he, turning to his other neighbour, and pointing past me with his umbrella.
"that's the Hall. Grand park, you see, and all them woods. Plenty of timber there, and lots of game. Oh, hallo! What now?"
This exclamation was occasioned by the sudden stoppage of the coach at the park gates.
"Gentlemen for Stanningley Hall?"
cried the coachman, and I rose and threw my carpet-bag onto the ground, preparatory to dropping myself down after it.
"Sickly, sir?"
asked my talkative neighbour, staring me in the face. I dare say it was white enough. "No. Here, coachman."
"Thank ye, sir. All right."
The coachman pocketed his fee and drove away, leaving me, not walking up the park, but pacing to and fro before its gates, with folded arms, and eyes fixed upon the ground, an overwhelming force of images, thoughts, impressions, crowding on my mind, and nothing tangibly distinct but this: my love had been cherished in vain, my hope was gone for ever. I must tear myself away at once, and banish or suppress all thoughts of her, like the remembrance of a wild mad dream. Gladly would I have lingered round the place for hours, in the hope of catching at least one distant glimpse of her before I went, but it must not be. I must not suffer her to see me, for what could have brought me hither but the hope of reviving her attachment, with a view hereafter to obtain her hand? And could I bear that she should think me capable of such a thing, of presuming upon the acquaintance, the love, if you will, accidentally contracted, or rather forced upon her against her will, when she was an unknown fugitive, toiling for her own support, apparently without fortune, family, or connections, to come upon her now, when she was reinstated in her proper sphere, and claim a share in her prosperity, which, had it never failed her, would most certainly have kept her unknown to me for ever, and this too when we had parted 16 months ago, and she had expressly forbidden me to hope for a reunion in this world, and never sent me a line or a message from that day to this. No, the very idea was intolerable. And even if she should have a lingering affection for me still, ought I to disturb her peace by awakening those feelings, to subject her to the struggles of conflicting duty and inclination, to whichsoever side the latter might allure, or the former imperatively call her, whether she should deem it her duty to risk the slights and censures of the world, the sorrow and displeasure of those she loved, for a romantic idea of truth and constancy to me, or to sacrifice her individual wishes to the feelings of her friends and her own sense of prudence and the fitness of things. No, and I would not. I would go at once, and she should never know that I had approached the place of her abode. For though I might disclaim all idea of ever aspiring to her hand, or even of soliciting a place in her friendly regard, her peace should not be broken by my presence, nor her heart afflicted by the sight of my fidelity. Adieu, then, dear Helen, for ever adieu. So said I, and yet I could not tear myself away. I moved a few paces, and then looked back for one last view of her stately home, that I might have its outward form at least impressed upon my mind as indelibly as her own image, which, alas, I must not see again. Then walked a few steps further, and then, lost in melancholy musings, paused again, and leant my back against a rough old tree that grew beside the road.
End of chapter 52. Of the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
While standing thus, absorbed in my gloomy reverie, a gentleman's carriage came round the corner of the road. I did not look at it, and had it rolled quietly by me, I should not have remembered the fact of its appearance at all. But a tiny voice from within it roused me by exclaiming,
"Mamma, mamma, here's Mr. Markham."
I did not hear the reply, but presently the same voice answered,
"It is indeed, mamma. Look for yourself."
I did not raise my eyes, but I suppose mamma looked, for a clear, melodious voice, whose tones thrilled through my nerves, exclaimed,
"Oh, aunt, here's Mr. Markham, Arthur's friend. Stop, Richard."
There was such evidence of joy, though suppressed excitement, in the utterance of those few words, especially that tremulous,
"Oh, aunt!"
that it threw me almost off my guard. The carriage stopped immediately, and I looked up and met the eye of a pale, grave, elderly lady surveying me from the open window. She bowed, and so did I, and then she withdrew her head, while Arthur screamed to the footman to let him out. But before that functionary could descend from his box, a hand was silently put forth from the carriage window. I knew that hand, though a black glove concealed its delicate whiteness, and half its fair portions, and, quickly seizing it, I pressed it in my own, ardently for a moment, but instantly recollecting myself, I dropped it, and it was immediately withdrawn.
"Were you coming to see us, or only passing by?"
asked the low voice of its owner, who I felt was attentively surveying my countenance from behind the thick black veil which, with the shadowing panels, entirely concealed her own from me. I came to see the place," faltered I.
"The place,"
repeated she, in a tone which betokened more displeasure or disappointment than surprise.
"Will you not enter it, then?"
"If you wish it."
"Can you doubt?"
"Yes, yes, he must enter,"
cried Arthur, running round from the other door, and seizing my hand in both his, he shook it heartily.
"Do you remember me, sir?"
said he. "Yes, full well, my little man, altered though you are. replied I, surveying the comparatively tall, slim young gentleman, with his mother's image visibly stamped upon his fair, intelligent features, in spite of the blue eyes beaming with gladness, and the bright locks clustering beneath his cap.
Am I not grown?
Said he, stretching himself up to his full height. Grown 3 inches, upon my word,
I was 7 last birthday.
was the proud rejoinder.
In 7 years more I shall be as tall as you, nearly.
Arthur,
Said his mother.
tell him to come in. Go on, Richard.
There was a touch of sadness as well as coldness in her voice, but I knew not to what to ascribe it. The carriage drove on, and entered the gates before us. My little companion led me up the park, discoursing merrily all the way. Arrived at the hall door, I paused on the steps, and looked round me, waiting to recover my composure if possible, or, at any rate, to remember my new-formed resolutions, and the principles on which they were founded. And it was not till Arthur had been for some time gently pulling my coat, and repeating his invitations to enter, that I at length consented to accompany him into the apartment where the ladies awaited us. Helen eyed me as I entered with a kind of gentle, serious scrutiny, and politely asked after Mrs. Markham and Rose. I respectfully answered her inquiries. Mrs. Maxwell begged me to be seated, observing it was rather cold, but she supposed I had not travelled far that morning. Not quite 20 miles, I answered.
Not on foot?
No, madam, by coach.
He is Rachel, sir,
said Arthur, the only truly happy one amongst us, directing my attention to that worthy individual, who had just entered to take her mistress's things. She vouchsafed me an almost friendly smile of recognition, a favour that demanded at least a civil salutation on my part, which was accordingly given and respectfully returned. She had seen the error of her former estimation of my character. When Helen was divested of her lugubrious bonnet and veil, her heavy winter cloak, etc., she looked so like herself that I knew not how to bear it. I was particularly glad to see her beautiful black hair, unstinted still, and unconcealed in its glossy luxuriance.
Mamma has left off her widow's cap in honour of uncle's marriage,
observed Arthur, reading my looks with a child's mingled simplicity and quickness of observation. Mamma looked grave, and Mrs. Maxwell shook her head.
And Aunt Maxwell is never going to leave off hers,
persisted the naughty boy. But when he saw that his pertness was seriously displeasing and painful to his aunt, he went and silently put his arm round her neck, kissed her cheek, and withdrew to the recess of one of the great bay windows, where he quietly amused himself with his dog, while Mrs. Maxwell gravely discussed with me the interesting topics of the weather, the season, and the roads. I considered her presence very useful as a check upon my natural impulses, an antidote to those emotions of tumultuous excitement, which would otherwise have carried me away against my reason and my will. But just then I felt the restraint almost intolerable, and I had the greatest difficulty in forcing myself to attend to her remarks and answer them with ordinary politeness, for I was sensible that Helen was standing within a few feet of me beside the fire. I dared not look at her, but I felt her eye was upon me, and from one hasty furtive glance I thought her cheek was slightly flushed, and that her fingers, as she played with her watch-chain, were agitated with that restless, trembling motion which betokens high excitement.
Tell me,
said she, availing herself of the first pause in the attempted conversation between her aunt and me, and speaking fast and low, with her eyes bent on the gold chain, for I now ventured another glance.
Tell me how you all are at Lindenhope. Has nothing happened since I left you?
I believe not.
Nobody dead? Nobody married?
No.
Or expecting to marry? No old ties dissolved or new ones formed? No old friends forgotten or supplanted?
She dropped her voice so low in the last sentence that no one could have caught the concluding words but myself, and at the same time turned her eyes upon me with a dawning smile, most sweetly melancholy, and a look of timid though keen inquiry that made my cheeks tingle with inexpressible emotions. "I believe not," I answered. "Certainly not, if others are as little changed as I." Her face glowed in sympathy with mine.
"And you really did not mean to call?"
she exclaimed. "I feared to intrude."
"To intrude?"
cried she, with an impatient gesture.
"What—"
But as if suddenly recollecting her aunt's presence, she checked herself, and, turning to that lady, continued,
"Why, aunt, this man is my brother's close friend, and was my own intimate acquaintance, for a few short months at least, and professed a great attachment to my boy; and when he passes the house, so many scores of miles from his home, he declines to look in for fear of intruding."
Mr. Markham is over-modest,
observed Mrs. Maxwell.
"Over ceremonious, rather,"
said her niece.
Well, it's no matter."
And, turning from me, she seated herself in a chair beside the table, and, pulling a book to her by the cover, began to turn over the leaves in an energetic kind of abstraction. "If I had known," said I, "that you would have honoured me by remembering me as an intimate acquaintance, I most likely should not have denied myself the pleasure of calling upon you. But I thought you had forgotten me long ago."
"You judged of others by yourself,"
muttered she, without raising her eyes from the book, but reddening as she spoke, and hastily turning over a dozen leaves at once. There was a pause, of which Arthur thought he might venture to avail himself, to introduce his handsome young setter, and show me how wonderfully it was grown and improved, and to ask after the welfare of its father Sancho. Mrs. Maxwell then withdrew to take off her things. Helen immediately pushed the book from her, and after silently surveying her son, his friend, and his dog for a few moments, she dismissed the former from the room under pretence of wishing him to fetch his last new book to show me. The child obeyed with alacrity, but I continued caressing the dog. The silence might have lasted till its master's return, had it depended upon me to break it. But in half a minute or less my hostess impatiently rose, and, taking her former station on the rug between me and the chimney corner, earnestly exclaimed,
"Gilbert, what is the matter with you? Why are you so changed? It is a very indiscreet question, I know."
She hastened to add,
"Perhaps a very rude one. Don't answer it, if you think so. But I hate mysteries and concealments."
"I am not changed, Helen. Unfortunately, I am as keen and passionate as ever. It is not I, it is circumstances that are changed."
"What circumstances? Do tell me."
Her cheek was blanched with the very anguish of anxiety. Could it be with the fear that I had rashly pledged my faith to another? "I'll tell you at once," said I. "I will confess that I came here for the purpose of seeing you, not without some momentary misgivings at my own presumption, and fears that I should be as little welcome as expected when I came. But I did not know that this estate was yours until, enlightened on the subject of your inheritance by the conversation of two fellow passengers in the last stage of my journey, and then I saw at once the folly of the hopes I had cherished, and the madness of retaining them a moment longer, and though I alighted at your gates, I determined not to enter within them. I lingered a few minutes to see the place, but was fully resolved to return to M without seeing its mistress."
"And if my aunt and I had not been just returning from our morning drive, I should have seen and heard no more of you?"
"I thought it would be better for both that we should not meet," replied I, as calmly as I could, but not daring to speak above my breath, for conscious inability to steady my voice, and not daring to look in her face, lest my firmness should forsake me altogether. "I thought an interview would only disturb your peace and madden me, but I am glad now of this opportunity of seeing you once more and knowing that you have not forgotten me, and of assuring you that I shall never cease to remember you." There was a moment's pause. Mrs. Huntingdon moved away, and stood in the recess of the window. Did she regard this as an intimation that modesty alone prevented me from asking her hand? And was she considering how to repulse me with the smallest injury to my feelings. Before I could speak to relieve her from such a perplexity, she broke the silence herself by suddenly turning towards me and observing,
"You might have had such an opportunity before, as far, I mean, as regards assuring me of your kindly recollections, and yourself of mine, if you had written to me."
"I would have done so, but I did not know your address, and did not like to ask your brother, because I thought he would object to my writing. But this would not have deterred me for a moment, if I could have ventured to believe that you expected to hear from me, or even wasted a thought upon your unhappy friend. But your silence naturally led me to conclude myself forgotten."
"Did you expect me to write to you, then?"
"No, Helen, Mrs. Huntingdon," said I, blushing at the implied imputation. "Certainly not. But if you had sent me a message through your brother, or even asked him about me now and then—"
"I did ask about you frequently. I was not going to do more,"
continued she, smiling,
"so long as you continued to restrict yourself to a few polite inquiries about my health."
"Your brother never told me that you had mentioned my name."
"Did you ever ask him?"
"No, for I saw he did not wish to be questioned about you, or to afford the slightest encouragement or assistance to my too obstinate attachment." Helen did not reply. "And he was perfectly right," added I, but she remained in silence, looking out upon the snowy lawn. "Oh, I will relieve her of my presence," thought I, and immediately I rose and advanced to take leave, with the most heroic resolution. But pride was at the bottom of it, or it could not have carried me through.
"Are you going already?"
said she, taking the hand I offered, and not immediately letting it go. Why should I stay any longer?
"Wait till Arthur comes, at least."
Only too glad to obey. I stood and leant against the opposite side of the window.
"You told me you were not changed."
said my companion.
"You are. Very much so."
"No, Mrs. Huntingdon, I only ought to be."
"Do you mean to maintain that you have the same regard for me that you had when last we met?"
"I have, but it would be wrong to talk of it now."
"It was wrong to talk of it then, Gilbert. It would not now, unless to do so would be to violate the truth."
I was too much agitated to speak, but, without waiting for an answer, she turned away her glistening eye and crimson cheek, and threw up the window and looked out. Whether to calm her own excited feelings, or to relieve her embarrassment, or only to pluck that beautiful half-grown Christmas rose that grew upon the little shrub without, just peeping from the snow that had hitherto, no doubt, defended it from the frost, and was now melting away in the sun. Pluck it however she did, and having gently dashed the glittering powder from its leaves, approached it to her lips and said,
"This rose is not so fragrant as a summer flower, but it has stood through hardships none of them could bear. The cold rain of winter has sufficed to nourish it, and its faint sun to warm it. The bleak winds have not blanched it, or broken its stem, and the keen frost has not blighted it. Look, Gilbert, it is still fresh and blooming as a flower can be, with the cold snow even now on its petals. Will you have it?"
I held out my hand. I dared not speak, lest my emotion should overmaster me. She laid the rose across my palm, but I scarcely closed my fingers upon it, so deeply was I absorbed in thinking what might be the meaning of her words, and what I ought to do or say upon the occasion, whether to give way to my feelings or restrain them still. Misconstruing this hesitation into indifference, or reluctance even, to accept her gift, Helen suddenly snatched it from my hand, threw it out onto the snow, shut down the window with an emphasis, and withdrew to the fire. "Helen, what means this?" I cried, electrified at this startling change in her demeanour.
"You do not understand my gift,"
said she.
"or, what is worse, you despised it. I'm sorry I gave it you, but since I did make such a mistake, the only remedy I could think of was to take it away."
"You misunderstood me cruelly," I replied, and in a minute I had opened the window again, leaped out, picked up the flower, brought it in, and presented it to her, imploring her to give it me again, and I would keep it for ever for her sake, and prize it more highly than anything in the world I possessed.
"And will this content you?"
said she, as she took it in her hand. "It shall," I answered.
"There, then, Take it.
I pressed it earnestly to my lips, and put it in my bosom, Mrs. Huntingdon looking on, with a half-sarcastic smile.
Now are you going?
Said she. I will, if I must.
You are changed,
persisted she.
You are grown either very proud or very indifferent.
I am neither, Helen, Mrs. Huntingdon. If you could see my heart.
You must be one, if not both. And why Mrs. Huntingdon? Why not Helen, as before?
Helen, then, dear Helen, I murmured. I was in an agony of mingled love, hope, delight, uncertainty, and suspense.
The rose I gave you was an emblem of my heart,
said she.
Would you take it away, and leave me here alone?
Would you give me your hand, too, if I asked it?
Have I not said enough?
She answered, with a most enchanting smile. I snatched her hand, and would have fervently kissed it, but suddenly checked myself and said, But have you considered the consequences?
Hardly, I think, or I should not have offered myself to one too proud to take me, or too indifferent to make his affection outweigh my worldly goods.
Stupid blockhead that I was! I trembled to clasp her in my arms, but dared not believe in so much joy, and yet restrained myself to say, But if you should repent?
It would be your fault,
she replied.
I never shall, unless you bitterly disappoint me. If you have not sufficient confidence in my affection to believe this, let me alone.
My darling angel, my own Helen, cried I, now passionately kissing the hand I still retained, and throwing my left arm round her. You never shall repent, if it depend on me alone. But have you thought of your aunt? I trembled for the answer, and clasped her closer to my heart, in the instinctive dread of losing my new-found treasure.
My aunt must not know of it yet,
said she.
She would think it a rash, wild step, because she could not imagine how well I know you. But she must know you herself, and learn to like you. You must leave us now, after lunch, and come again in spring, and make a longer stay, and cultivate her acquaintance, and I know you will like each other.
And then you will be mine, said I, printing a kiss upon her lips, and another, for I was as daring and impetuous now as I had been backward and constrained before.
No, in another year,
replied she, gently disengaging herself from my embrace, but still fondly clasping my hand. Another year! Oh, Helen, I could not wait so long.
Where is your fidelity?
I mean, I could not endure the misery of so long a separation.
It would not be a separation. We will write every day. My spirit shall be always with you, and sometimes you shall see me with your bodily eye. I will not be such a hypocrite as to pretend that I desire to wait so long myself, but as my marriage is to please myself alone, I ought to consult my friends about the time of it.
Your friends will disapprove.
They will not greatly disapprove, dear Gilbert,
said she, earnestly kissing my hand.
They cannot, when they know you, or, if they could, they would not be true friends. I should not care for their estrangement. Now are you satisfied?
She looked up in my face, with a smile of ineffable tenderness. Can I be otherwise with your love? And do you love me, Helen? Said I, not doubting the fact, but wishing to hear it confirmed by her own acknowledgment.
If you loved as I do,
she earnestly replied,
you would not have so nearly lost me. These scruples of false delicacy and pride would never thus have troubled you. You would have seen that the greatest worldly distinctions and discrepancies of rank, birth, and fortune are as dust in the balance compared with the unity of accordant thoughts and feelings, and truly loving, sympathizing hearts and souls.
But this is too much happiness, said I, embracing her again. I have not deserved it. Helen, I dare not believe in such felicity, and the longer I have to wait, the greater will be my dread that something will intervene to snatch you from me. And think, 1,000 things may happen in a year. I shall be in one long fever of restless terror and impatience all the time. And besides, winter is such a dreary season.
I thought so too,
replied she gravely.
I would not be married in winter, in December at least.
She added, with a shudder, for in that month had occurred both the ill-starred marriage that had bound her to her former husband, and the terrible death that released her.
And therefore I said another year, in spring.
Next spring?
No, next autumn, perhaps.
Summer, then?
Well, the close of summer. There now, be satisfied.
While she was speaking, Arthur re-entered the room. Good boy for keeping out so long.
Mamma, I couldn't find the book in either of the places you told me to look for it.
There was a conscious something in mamma's smile that seemed to say,
No, dear, I knew you could not.
But Rachel got it for me at last. Look, Mr. Markham, a natural history, with all kinds of birds and beasts in it, and the reading as nice as the pictures.
In great good humour, I sat down to examine the book, and drew the little fellow between my knees. Had he come a minute before, I should have received him less graciously, but now I affectionately stroked his curling locks, and even kissed his ivory forehead. He was my own Helen's son, and therefore mine, and as such I have ever since regarded him. That pretty child is now a fine young man. He has realized his mother's brightest expectations, and is at present residing in Grassdale Manor with his young wife, the merry little Helen Hattersley of yore. I had not looked through half the book before Mrs. Maxwell appeared to invite me into the other room to lunch. That lady's cool, distant manners rather chilled me at first, but I did my best to propitiate her, and not entirely without success, I think, even in that first short visit, for when I talked cheerfully to her, she gradually became more kind and cordial, and when I departed she bade me a gracious adieu, hoping ere long to have the pleasure of seeing me again.
But you must not go till you have seen the conservatory, my aunt's winter garden,
said Helen, as I advanced to take leave of her, with as much philosophy and self-command as I could summon to my aid. I gladly availed myself of such a respite, and followed her into a large and beautiful conservatory, plentifully furnished with flowers, considering the season, but of course I had little attention to spare for them. It was not, however, for any tender colloquy that my companion had brought me there.
My aunt is particularly fond of flowers,
she observed.
And she is fond of Stanningley too. I brought you here to offer a petition in her behalf, that this may be her home as long as she lives, and, if it be not our home likewise, that I may often see her and be with her, for I fear she will be sorry to lose me, and though she leads a retired and contemplative life, she is apt to get low-spirited if left too much alone.
By all means, dearest Helen, do what you will with your own. I should not dream of wishing your aunt to leave the place under any circumstances, and we will live either here or elsewhere as you and she may determine, and you shall see her as often as you like. I know she must be pained to part with you, and I am willing to make any reparation in my power. I love her for your sake, and her happiness shall be as dear to me as that of my own mother.
Thank you, darling. You shall have a kiss for that. Good-bye. There now. There, Gilbert. Let me go. He is Arthur. Don't astonish his infantile brain with your madness.
But it is time to bring my narrative to a close. Anyone but you would say I have made it too long already, but for your satisfaction I will add a few words more, because I know you will have a fellow feeling for the old lady, and will wish to know the last of her history. I did come again in spring, and agreeably to Helen's injunctions, did my best to cultivate her acquaintance. She received me very kindly, having been doubtless already prepared to think highly of my character by her niece's too favourable report. I turned my best side out, of course, and we got along marvellously well together. When my ambitious intentions were made known to her, she took it more sensibly than I had ventured to hope. Her only remark on the subject in my hearing was,
"And so, Mr. Markham, you are going to rob me of my niece, I understand. Well, I hope God will prosper your union, and make my dear girl happy at last. Could you have been contented to remain single, I own I should have been better satisfied. But if she must marry again, I know of no one, now living and of a suitable age, to whom I would more willingly resign her than yourself, or who would be more likely to appreciate her worth, and make her truly happy, as far as I can tell."
Of course I was delighted with the compliment, and hoped to show her that she was not mistaken in her favourable judgment.
I have, however, one request to offer,
continued she.
It seems I am still to look on Stanningley as my home. I wish you to make it yours likewise, for Helen is attached to the place, and to me, as I am to her. There are painful associations connected with Grassdale, which she cannot easily overcome, and I shall not molest you with my company or interference here. I am a very quiet person, and shall keep my own apartments, and attend to my own concerns, and only see you now and then.
Of course I most readily consented to this, and we lived in the greatest harmony with our dear aunt until the day of her death, which melancholy event took place a few years after. Melancholy, not to herself, for it came quietly upon her, and she was glad to reach her journey's end, but only to the few loving friends and grateful dependents she left behind. To return, however, to my own affairs. I was married in summer, on a glorious August morning. It took the whole 8 months, and all Helen's kindness and goodness to boot, to overcome my mother's prejudices against my bride-elect, and to reconcile her to the idea of my leaving Linden Grange, and living so far away. Yet she was gratified at her son's good fortune, after all, and proudly attributed it all to his own superior merits and endowments. I bequeathed the farm to Fergus, with better hopes of its prosperity than I should have had a year ago, under similar circumstances, for he had lately fallen in love with the Vicar of L's eldest daughter, a lady whose superiority had roused his latent virtues, and stimulated him to the most surprising exertions, not only to gain her affection and esteem, and to obtain a fortune sufficient to aspire to her hand, but to render himself worthy of her in his own eyes, as well as in those of her parents, and in the end he was successful, as you already know. As for myself, I need not tell you how happily my Helen and I have lived together, and how blessed we still are in each other's society, and in the promising young scions that are growing up about us. We are just now looking forward to the advent of you and Rose, for the time of your annual visit draws nigh, when you must leave your dusty, smoky, noisy, toiling, striving city, for a season of invigorating relaxation and social retirement with us. Till then, farewell. Gilbert Markham. Stanningley, June 10th, 1847.
End of chapter 53. End of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, by Anne Bronte.